Tatiyampi Dhammam Saranam Gacchami. Dutiyampi Sangham Saranam Gacchami. Tatiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami. Tatiyampi Dhammam Saranam Gacchami. Tatiyampi Sangham Saranam Gacchami. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to the organizers, everybody who has put all the work into creating this. And I was one of the fortunate ones that just had to drive up the mountain from Los Angeles, where I live. Not so much travel. I spend a little bit of time talking about what brought me to Buddhism, being somebody who grew up in America, and although I would be considered maybe second generation American Buddhist, because my father, who was of Jewish heritage, became Buddhist, turned towards Buddhism in the 1950s, 1960s, before I was born. And he was of that generation of the beatniks and the hippies, and a whole generation of Americans who were really rejecting the Western religion and the Western societal norms. And a lot of them were just looking towards Asia for wisdom, for truth. Feeling like they weren't finding it in their own religion and certainly in their own culture. And my father was one of those who maybe you call New Age. He never really chose a path. A little bit of Hinduism, a little bit of Buddhism, a little bit of Sufism, this sort of mystics, the hippies who just kind of said, as long as it's not Western, as long as it's Eastern wisdom, we are interested in it. And then they kind of made their own American hippie religion. I grew up watching people meditate. There was meditation around me. But my parents divorced when I was very young. Are you hearing me okay? Is it loud enough? Yeah, okay. Good. My parents divorced when I was very young. My mother was an alcoholic, had a major drug and alcohol problem. And my father was teaching meditation and leading workshops and stuff, and he was gone quite a bit. So he wasn't very present. He had dedicated his life towards service, but sometimes not as present for his own family. I'm not sure exactly what the inner workings were for me, or if there's possibly some reincarnation, some things that I was born with. But by the time I was 5 years old, I was feeling suicidal. And I had been taught about reincarnation, and my father had done quite a bit of work with dying people. He was doing hospice, working with people on their deathbed. And I saw people dying, and death was familiar to me. But I was also taught that death isn't the end. I was taught that when you die, you have another lifetime, and it's safe to die, was sort of what I was taught. It's not a big deal, not a big punishment, it's natural. And with my own pain and confusion that I was in as a child with divorce and alcoholism and some abuse at an abusive stepfather, I started to contemplate suicide, thinking that, even at 5 years old, thinking that I could get out of this pain, and that it wasn't like gone forever, but that I would have another lifetime. Not understanding some of the other connotations of the act of suicide might have on rebirth. But, at 5 years old, I think for me it was more like the cartoons, American cartoons. I always think of like the Road Runner and the Wile E. Coyote. And it's like every day that coyote dies. But he's always right there again. The next show he dies and he's reborn and he's dying. So American reincarnation. From the cartoons. So I was in a lot of confusion and a lot of pain. And what I found, which I think a lot of people find, which is drugs and alcohol, to take the edge off, to take some of the pain away, to replace some of the difficulty with some temporary pleasure and intoxication. And I think that in some ways, for me, the drugs and alcohol were actually a solution, maybe even saved my life. It's very possible that I would have committed suicide if I didn't have the drugs to numb some of the pain that I was in. But what happens often with drugs and alcohol is that there's a line that's crossed between this is fun to now this is creating more suffering in my life. It's not alleviating suffering. Now I'm actually an alcoholic and I have to drink every day, and I'm a drug addict and I'm stealing and lying and fighting and to support a drug habit. It's not self-medication that's a solution. It's creating more and more suffering in my life as a teenager. I wasn't really taught about Buddhism. It was modeled. I wasn't sure if they were Buddhist or Hindu, my parents. There was some times where they would say, maybe you should try meditating. I remember my parents paid my older brother. He was like, oh, meditation, that's easy. And they said, well, we'll give you $50 if you can sit still for an hour. You think it's so easy. Let's see you take the posture and hold it for an hour. And he was like a strong kind of, he's like, I can do that. And like 20 minutes, he's like, I can't do that. But it wasn't really, I wasn't raised Buddhist, I wasn't raised with it, but they were doing it and it was sort of around. And I got myself into so much trouble and so much suffering, and I spent a couple of years, almost 2 years, addicted to cocaine, to crack cocaine as a teenager. And drinking alcohol every day and in and out of jail. Kept getting sent to juvenile hall, and by the time I was 17 years old, I had 3 felonies, 3 major arrests, and was really looking at a path that was going to be prison for a really long time. And while I was incarcerated, while I was in a jail cell, I got a phone call from my father. My father lived in New Mexico. I was in California. And he said, maybe you should try meditation. And I said, I need some real help. How about a lawyer? And he said, well, maybe I will help you with a lawyer, but really I believe that mindfulness will help you. And he shared with me that one of the reasons that he had been into meditation was because of his own history. He had been a drug addict before I was born. And he had been, just seeking happiness, and nothing had worked. And he turned towards spiritual practice for his own healing, for his own awakening. And he said, mindfulness is the thing that has worked best. So he says, I encourage you to try. He says, you're in jail, you might be going to prison. But a lot of what the suffering in your current life is, you're in a jail cell, you have food, you have shelter. Most of your suffering is in the future, what's going to happen. Most of your suffering is in the past, what has already happened. He said, if you bring your attention to the present moment, then you're just with the direct experience of the present moment, and not the fear of the future or the regret of the past. My father gave me simple meditation instructions in that jail cell. He said, just bring your attention to the breath. Breathing in, feel the breath, know that you're breathing in. Breathing out, feel the breath, know that you're breathing out. Every time your attention wanders away into thinking, gently return, come back to the breath. He said it might be helpful even to count the breath, breathing in 1, breathing out 2, breathing in 3. He said if you can get to 10, you're already an expert. He said if you lose count, then just start over at 1. And very powerful experience for me, 17 years old, detoxing from drugs. Not sure if I was going to spend many years in prison. But it was my first experience of finding a refuge. Finding the possibility of being free from the suffering that my mind was creating. I still had to deal with the pain of my current situation. It was still very unpleasant to be in jail. It was still very unpleasant to be in the trouble that I was in, to be in the body and the drugs detoxing that I was in. But the present moment gave me a refuge and a relief that I had never had before. Up until trying meditation, I had basically believed and obeyed my mind my whole life. My mind told me to do all kinds of awful things, and I did it. My untrained mind, with the pain of my childhood, told me to drink and steal and lie and cheat, and I just obeyed it. And when I learned mindfulness, I realized for the first time in my life, I don't have to obey my mind. It's actually optional. I never knew that before I started meditating. You mean you don't have to do everything that you think? You don't have to act on all of these urges and fears and bad advice of our own minds? It was a major revelation to me, that simple mindfulness practice. And I found a true refuge in the present moment that just resonated deeply within me as a path to follow up on. Now, I think there's also something true for me, I don't know, but as somebody who has suffered from addiction and has a compulsive, I don't get one tattoo, I get lots of tattoos. I don't do anything very sort of moderately, which has been a problem in my life, but has also been quite a blessing when it has come to spiritual practice. Because when I got this taste of the possibility of awakening through meditation, it sent me on this search, on this quest, on this embracing, and kind of knowing this Buddha guy knew something that I don't know. And so then I really wanted to study. But there's quite a dilemma for Westerners when you get introduced to Buddhism, because then there's the question, what kind? And should I be a Tibetan Buddhist or a Vietnamese Buddhist or a Japanese Buddhist, right? Because there's no American Buddhism. So it's not like I can just be like, okay, well, I'll be an American Buddhist like Dad and Mom and Grandma and Grandpa, y'all already born into, most of you, into a Buddhist tradition. But for me, then I have to find my place. What tradition? And that was quite an interesting search. Has been quite an interesting search. To try to find my place. And of course, all Buddhist traditions have similarities, and the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and but there's differences also, the way that Buddhism is practiced country to country and tradition to tradition. I also wasn't even sure in the beginning that I would become a Buddhist. I thought, I knew that spiritual practice, that meditation was absolutely what I needed, but I wasn't sure what kind. And I had a sense that Christianity or Judaism wasn't really for me, but I didn't have any real experience with it. I'm not one of those recovering Catholics who had that conditioning, and then I didn't have the Western religious conditioning, but I had a sense that God, the creation, theism wasn't for me. But I figured I better read the Bible so I know what I'm talking about. So I actually read the Bible. read the Quran. I studied. I did a sort of personal religious studies course to find where do I land? What resonates as true for me? Rather than just picking and sticking with it, I thought, let me really investigate this. Let me look deeply into the different world religions. At some point, it became clear to me that Buddhism was what resonated most in my heart. That the Four Noble Truths, I think the Buddha, starting with acknowledging how much suffering there is in human life, was easy for me because I was coming from a place of a lot of suffering. So I was like, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's starting with acknowledging how difficult it is to be human, to have a mind and a body. And maybe one of the things that hooked me most and what I've been teaching about and was when I heard that the Buddha said that his path to enlightenment was one that went against the stream. So the name of my organization, book I wrote, about going against greed, going against hatred, going against delusion. He said, he used this term, patiso tagami, which is a Pali term that literally means going against the current or going against the forces in the world that create suffering, attachment, aversion, judgment, fear. And he talked about, when I realized that the Buddha was talking about awakening as an act of rebellion. And I thought I was a rebel my whole life. I just didn't quite know what to rebel against. I was rebelling in the wrong way. I was rebelling against myself. I was rebelling by taking drugs. I thought that was rebellious to be a drug addict. And then finding out that the greatest rebellion is towards truth, is rebelling against ignorance, is rebelling against selfishness, rebelling against this, as Tay said, this American, but I think it's more than American, this worldwide lie that materialism will ever lead to happiness. That even if you have the car and the job and it just doesn't work. That nothing outside of ourselves is going to lead to the awakening and to the happiness and to the well-being that we seek. And this is, I believe, this is a core teaching of the Buddha, at least in the Pali Canon, the original teachings that I am most familiar with. So I knew for sure that learning the teachings of the Buddha and applying those teachings to my life was the path for me. I was in. But there was still the question for me in my early practice of whether I would become a monastic or I would stay a layperson. I was very intent, and in my 20s, and a sort of imbalanced, I was intent on enlightenment, on awakening. And I also was a little competitive, like I wanted to get enlightened before any of my friends. I was a little delusional about it, right? I was serious about practice, but I was also didn't quite get that it wasn't a race or a competition or... In my early 20s, when I was trying to figure out whether I would become a monk, I had some monastic teachers, mostly from the Thai tradition, Thai forest tradition. And I was very inspired by them, and I was very interested in the possibility of celibacy and full renunciation of money, and because I knew that I had this internal knowing that I wasn't going to find what I was looking for in the world. And that the Dharma, the teachings and the practices were going to be the source. So it made some sense to say, well, should I just ordain? But I wasn't quite ready to ordain. And so I tried to do sort of a pseudo-monasticism in the world where I spent 2 years completely celibate. And a vegan diet, no animal products of any kind. And I even gave up caffeine and sugar and had this very pretty high level of renunciation, going from this drug addict street thug to this like kind of very renounced and imbalanced, but really trying to find the teachings and to apply them, pretending like I was a monk while still working and living in the world. I went to Southeast Asia. I didn't make it to Vietnam, but I went to Thailand and Cambodia and practiced, and then to Burma and Sri Lanka, and I practiced in some monasteries, and to kind of see should I ordain. And when I got there, mostly I was probably just scared of the big commitment of ordination, but there was a shift in me where being there and in the monasteries, it became clear to me that I wasn't going to become a monk, but that I wanted to have a family and that I wanted to practice the Dharma, the Buddha's teachings, in a family and in a life and in the world. And so I kind of came back to the States, and I didn't have much of an education. I had, as a troubled youth, I had dropped out of, I think my last probably formal education was junior high school. And so I had to go back and get my diploma, my high school diploma, and then I went back and slowly got my undergraduate, my bachelor's degree, and then I had the momentum going in my late 20s, early 30s, and said, for a long time I thought maybe I'd work in the medical field. I wanted to help people. I knew I wanted to help people. I had spent a lot of time hurting people. I knew I wanted to help. But at some point I realized it wasn't the body that I was so interested in helping. But I really wanted to help the mind, the spirit, and in the Western way to do that is psychology. And I'd already had some sense that maybe I'd start to teach Buddhism at some point. But it made sense to go back and to get a degree in psychology. So I went through school and got a degree in counseling psychology, a master's degree. Also working with Americans, it's such a psychologically conditioned culture to be able to teach the Dharma and to use Western language has been very helpful, and to be able to do it in a counseling and psychotherapeutic. And I just knew also as a Dharma teacher it's important to learn how to be able to make a living because most of the time I teach for donations, and it's actually quite hard to make a living as a Buddhist teacher and to support a family and everything. So having a psychotherapy practice is a paycheck is nice. At some point my teachers, I guess after I've been practicing sincerely for about 10 years, my teachers asked me to begin to teach. They said, we would like to see you, it's clear that what has happened for you has been a major shift, and many of my friends would come to me and say, like, you used to be a real jerk, and you're less of a jerk now, and it's clearly something about your meditation and your Buddhist practice. And so started to teach little meditation groups in my living room, and we started to go back into the same jails, the juvenile halls that I had been in when I started meditating, and going back in and teaching meditation in those institutions. A real full circle, coming from being an inmate to coming back in to be of service and to share mindfulness and that simple tool, present moment, better than the future, better than the past. The only true refuge we have, present moment. A big part of my practice has not only been mindfulness, and like I said, when I heard the Four Noble Truths, I really knew this is true. The Buddha's pointing out the suffering, the cause of suffering, the end of suffering. I knew in my heart that that was true. But then when I started to hear about loving kindness and compassion and forgiveness, I had some hesitance. I wasn't sure. I thought maybe, as like the Buddha talked about suffering, I believe that. Loving kindness, I think the hippies added that in. That sounds like some peace and love stuff. I like this suffering business. That was easier for me to grasp. Because I had a lot of self-hatred, because I had a lot of guilt, I had a lot of shame, to start the process of loving kindness for myself and to start the process of asking for forgiveness, taking full responsibility for my actions, for my karma. It was a very difficult practice. When I learned the metta, loving kindness practices, I did them. Mindfulness, like I said, I had an immediate result. I knew this was going to work. Loving kindness, when I would say, may I be happy, or may all beings be at ease, I didn't mean it. I couldn't do it in a sincere way. Luckily, I had a lot of confidence and I kept doing it. And my teachers say, just do it. You don't have to mean it. Just say it. You're training your mind. Just say it. You don't keep saying it, and eventually you'll mean it. And for me, it took me a couple of years of doing loving kindness, of doing compassion practices, of taking teachings and going on retreats, before I started to mean loving kindness, before I started to be sincere about wanting myself to be happy or wanting others to be happy, or actually even being able to fathom caring about all living beings. It took me years of doing the practice. I don't know if you have a specific practice in your traditions around forgiveness, but I was also taught a meditation around forgiveness, around saying, I forgive myself, and I forgive others, and I ask for forgiveness from the people that I've harmed. That was a majorly important part of my healing, part of my awakening, and part of my ability to live a healthy life and live in the world and to get free from the destructive habits that I had been in. I had to forgive myself. I had to forgive my parents for not being so present, not paying attention, for their own suffering. I had to forgive this world, this culture, for all of its confused messages that's constantly giving us. I remember after about 10 years of practice, maybe more, 10 years of loving kindness, forgiveness practice, I finally came to this place where I felt like I didn't hate anybody, including myself, that I actually had the experience of love for all living beings. And I could even try, I was even testing it, like, is there any resentment? Is there anybody that I'm holding outside of my heart? And there was that moment where I was like, no, I got there. And this delusion of like, okay, cool, finished. I forgave everybody. And maybe even some delusion of like, oh, I'm getting enlightened. Maybe I'm an awakened being. Of course, that experience didn't last. Because what I was forgetting was impermanence. That I had been, years and years of practice had finally softened my heart. One of the ways that I think about it is that I had lived in like a hell realm. I had lived like in an animal or hell realm, or like a hungry ghost realm of existence. And that what had actually happened is that finally I had taken birth as a human being. Not a bodhisattva, not a Buddha, but finally I had arrived into humanity and what it's like to actually feel love and kindness and compassion. And I had forgotten impermanence. I had forgotten that everything, even the big insights we have in the spiritual path, also are temporary. They come, open heart, and then somebody upsets you and resentment again. Not free forever. Not for me anyways. Maybe that's what happens for the Buddhas, but hasn't been my experience. My life these days is as a full-time Buddhist teacher and counselor, psychotherapist. I have 2 small children. I have a 1.5-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl. Parenting is part of my meditation practice. It is not outside. Being a husband is part of my spiritual practice. It's not outside of my practice. Mindfulness in my daily life and how I interact, loving kindness in my daily life, how I work with my students, how I work with my family, how I drive on the Los Angeles freeways. I was at Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery yesterday before I came here. We were having a teacher meeting, and a senior monk came to me and he said, Noah, you're in the world. It looks like you're doing a good job of practicing while very busy in the world. He said, and some of our people, they live here, and we get to practice all of the time, and we kind of get to go slow. But then when they integrate back into the world, they have a difficult time maintaining mindfulness and renunciation while living in the fast-paced world. He said, do you have any advice? And I had like 2 minutes. The one advice that I gave him was, I said, this is what I tried to do. I don't do it perfectly. But I said, make everything your practice. Don't say that your spiritual practice is at the temple or on the meditation cushion, but that mindfulness is your whole practice for every aspect of your life, including your sexuality, including your relationship to money, including your relationship to each other. Make everything your practice, and don't think you have to go slow to pay attention. Because going slow can help us pay attention, but so many of us live in this world where you just can't go slow all the time. You'll get a ticket for driving too slow. Sometimes when we end retreats, we tell the people, now you're going to go out, you're going to get on the freeway, now don't drive too slow. After going so slow on retreat, it's how do I have a practice that includes everything? I believe fully that this was the Buddha's intention. The fact that in the Eightfold Path he put right livelihood, work as part of our spiritual practice. The fact that he included right speech, knowing that communication is going to be a huge part of our spiritual practice, how we speak to each other, how we pay attention to each other. That the precept around sexuality is fairly liberal, not, but that we just have to be wise and careful with our sexual, unless you're a monastic, of course, and then you're celibate, but if you're going to be in the world, let sexuality be part of your practice, not something that's shameful or separate, but it's something that you bring mindfulness to, something that we approach with loving kindness, with generosity. I'd like to spend the last few minutes, if there's any questions, a little bit of dialogue. But the last thing that I'll say is what I'm currently doing is working on a Buddhist approach to addiction and a treatment plan based on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path for people who are suffering of any kind of addiction, alcoholism, gambling addictions, food addictions, drug addictions. I really believe that what the Buddha is teaching, the cause of all human suffering being craving, this fits perfectly with the craving of people who are in addiction. And I've been in the 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous world for 25 years since I started meditating 25 years ago. But it's a very Christian approach. It says only God can heal you. And it doesn't give the empowerment that Buddhism does that says self-awakening, the name of your retreat here, that actually each human being has the capacity through their own effort to train the mind, to train the heart, to awaken, and to heal addiction and to heal suffering. So I'm sort of taking this, making this commitment to bringing a Buddhist approach to drug addiction and to alcoholism, and to hopefully offering that out. Somebody I was speaking to on the way in was talking about homeless people in Los Angeles who, you can go and they give you food, but you have to listen to a sermon on some Christian sermon, and that there's almost no Buddhist services for homeless people, almost no Buddhist services for non-theistic, for drug addicts. So if you're an alcoholic and you go to 12-step meetings, you start to have to pretend that you believe in God, rather than understanding that the Buddha's teachings are something that you do yourself, rather than grace, rather than something that's bestowed upon you. So I'd like to open it if there's any questions about anything that I've said. We have just a few minutes, please.
So is there any 12-step with 12-step with Buddhism? Because I also went to a couple sections with the 12-step, and as you said, there's mostly Christians, but is there,
There is. He's saying, is there 12 steps with Buddhism? There is. There's been several people. There's a few good books written about how to understand the 12-step process through a Buddhist perspective, which I think is wonderful, and people are using it that way. But my own feeling is, I don't need to keep trying to understand Christianity through a Buddhist lens, right? Because it really is. It's like, how can I make this concept of God, the Creator God, this very Christian concept, how can I make that fit with my Buddhist understanding? And I feel like it's wonderful that it exists for people in that 12-step room, and it's been helpful to me. But I feel like the Buddha's teachings are enough. I don't need to translate the Bible through Buddhism in order to address my addiction. I feel like, the Four Noble Truths are a perfect treatment plan. The Eightfold Path is a perfect treatment plan for all humanity, and including alcoholics and addicts. Please take.
From your personal experience as well as the professional experience, could you please give us in general, monastic and non-monastic practitioner, what is the best way to introduce Buddhism to average American without religious factor, and it's easy for them to accept and practice?
Well, I think you already know the answer to the question. The question is, the best way to introduce Buddhism is mindfulness. It feels like really our country is embracing mindfulness. And you can teach mindfulness without teaching Buddhism. And people know, they get the direct experience of the present moment and what it's like to train the mind to come back. All of these wonderful scientific studies are happening around mindfulness. There's a lot of wonderful things that are happening that are introducing people. I'm also trained in that secular tradition, but for myself, I decided quite a long time ago that I'm not going to pretend like it's not Buddhism. That I love Buddhism. And I love the Buddha, and I have so much gratitude and appreciation for this ancient and wonderful tradition that I don't want to, personally, I don't want to take mindfulness away from. And it's like, then how do you teach the rest of the Eightfold Path, right? Mindfulness is only the seventh factor. Of course, it's conjoining with the rest of it. But the rest, it's like people need the whole life, not just mindfulness, but it is the best doorway. We get people at our meditation center all the time that went and did a mindfulness stress reduction, and then they come and find Buddhism. But it feels like it is the best doorway. And there's a lot of that happening, and I'm glad that it's happening.
Life into the practice of Buddhism. My question is, how does your wife and your kids, how do they respond to you being such a hardcore Buddhist?
My wife she practices some. She's not as hardcore, as serious about it as I am. She has started to practice more since we've been together. And they'll travel with me on retreats quite a bit, so she's around it. She's getting more and more interested in her own life. My children are still, it's just what they're growing up with. My daughter loves to come. Like, I had a couple retreats where my family was with me, and it's a silent retreat, and everybody there is in silence, sitting and walking and sitting and walking. So my family obviously is not in silence. My daughter loves it. She likes to come in for the talks, the Dharma talks, and at the end we do a blessing cord ceremony, and she wants to hand out the blessing cords, and she's a little bit of a kind of showman. She wants to be on stage, she wants to ring the bell, and so they're pretty integrated into it. I was just saying I'm looking at this place for the possibility of a family retreat here, because it is close to us. We do a lot of our retreats in the desert, but in the summer when the kids are out of school, it's too hot in the desert. So this would be maybe a nice place to bring the families and to integrate them. Because some of our things are called Dharma Punks is the name of the book that I wrote. So my daughter hasn't quite got that it's Buddhism. She'd just be like, oh, they're Dharma punks. So like if she was here, she would say, oh, there's a bunch of Dharma punks here. She doesn't quite get, like she would see the robes and she'd be like, oh, they're Dharma punks.
You mentioned about you were visiting Thich Nhat Hanh retreat, and you're saying that there are two advice for the lay people like us that have busy life, and one of them being making everything a daily practice. What's the second advice that you have for them?
Well, to keep sitting. The formal practice, the daily formal practice, which is so necessary to start our day with mindfulness and with loving kindness and with a practice on the cushion or couch. It doesn't matter to me whether you're on the cushion or the couch. But to start the day with formal practice and then to include the rest of the day as the informal training. So that everything. But without the formal practice, it's I don't think it's quite honest to say like, oh no, I'm just practicing mindfulness in daily life, without doing also a formal sitting practice where you're really just no distractions, bringing your attention back, investigating the present time.
For how long?
It's different for different. I would say a minimum of 20 minutes. I encourage people, if you can build up a sitting practice of 45 minutes. I know in my first few years I would sit for 20 minutes, and there would just be that sort of like, relaxing into it. And then I'd get up. But I found that when I started sitting past the 20 minutes, into 30 and 40 minutes, then I could like hang out in the relaxation, hang out in let the body get really uncomfortable, and then the opportunity to meet that pain in the body with compassion. It's not good to be too comfortable in meditation, because then you don't have any opportunity to really change your relationship to the pain, which is a big part of what we're trying to do. Can we tolerate pain? Can we care about pain? Can we forgive it? So 20-minute minimum, but trying to get more like a 45-minute sitting practice is my opinion. I heard one Burmese teacher who said minimum of 4 hours a day. He said if you want to make progress, 4 hours a day. He said 2 hours a day just to not backslide. He said if you're practicing less than 2 hours a day, you're backsliding into hell. I said, okay, a little too intense for me. 20 minutes would be good. Please.
I have a question. When was your last tattoo? You have a giant Buddha tattoo in your back?
Yes. Covered in Buddha tattoos. My last tattoos were the name of I've sort of run out of space, so I had to like put my children's names like on my hands right there. Like I have a Buddha on my chest. My back is the wheel of life. Held in Mara's mouth, where the 6 realms of existence and the 12 links of dependent origination. So you have a bunch of Buddha tattoos. I have Buddha, Tara, and then this side is the Hindu, my father's side, with the monkey god and Krishna. Most of my tattoos are after I started practicing and are about practice. Almost all of them. Please?
You don't understand why it's just there. In our field, there's at this stage now, there's many teenagers, especially even in the Buddhist programs. They're they have bad thoughts and they just say, I don't understand why. And instead of going to see therapists because they don't want to get into the mental health field, and a little bit they'll be a little afraid to go into talk to the monks and nuns because they're not comfortable yet. So what advice would you give to people that come approach to you or one of our youth leaders here? What would we do to help?
Mostly normalizing it, I think. Is that, like, of course your mind would think about suicide at some point when you're in enough difficulty. It's not your fault. So for me, more like normalizing, it's not like you're suicidal, but like this is just what happens in the mind when you're uncomfortable. Your mind, your survival instinct says, I want to get out of pain. What do I have to do to get out of pain? And one of the thoughts is like, well, if I didn't exist, I believe that this is part of the second noble truth. There's 3 baskets in craving. There's the craving for sense pleasures, and then there's the craving for permanent existence and the craving for non-existence. I believe that the suicidal ideation, that thought, is part of the second noble truth, is that at times you will crave to not exist. You will say, this sucks, I don't want to experience it. And that's normal. Now, if it becomes an obsessive, an ideation that's ongoing, of course it needs to be addressed. But to try to take the shame out of it, to try to take the, to normalize it and say like, oh yeah, that's not so abnormal to have that thought. Even the Buddha addressed it in the second noble truth, that that thought will arise. You will crave for non-existence at some point. Yeah. So enough. Thank you so much for your wise attention.
Mr. Levine, this is a great pleasure to have you here today, and a wonderful session of sharing your life experience to the Awakening Camp. And I'm sure, Will, that all of us will benefit from your experience and sharing your story. So we cannot thank you enough, but we have some gift for memory of us in the first Awakening Camp in 2013. Thank you very much, and we wish you the best.